CEO panics when the system crashes. Then a janitor's daughter walks in and... Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The tower of Finch Industries was a shard of glass and steel thrust into the bruised gray sky. A monument to a legacy. Alastair Finch felt more like a sentence than a birthright. From his office on the 80th floor, the city below was a sprawling circuit board, its millions of lives reduced to flickering, distant lights. The silence in his office was a manufactured thing, a luxury bought with triple-pane glass and the hushed deference of his employees. But lately, another silence had begun to creep in, an older, colder quiet that emanated from the building's very bones. Alastair stood at the vast window, his hands clasped behind his back, a posture his father had always favored. He was 38, with a face that had once been boyish but was now being carved into something harder by the relentless pressure of his position. His father, the legendary founder, had been a titan, a man who saw the world in lines of code and built an empire from them. Alastair saw the world in profit margins and shareholder reports, and he felt like a caretaker in a museum, dusting off relics he didn't fully understand. The company's heart was not in the boardroom, but deep in the sub-basement, in a climate-controlled cavern known as the core. There, rows of monolithic servers hummed the constant, low liturgy of the digital age. This was Helios, the system his father had designed, a complex, self-regulating network that managed every aspect of their global logistics empire. It was more than software. It was the company's central nervous system, its memory, and its future. And for the past week, it had been twitching. Small things at first. A fractional delay in data retrieval. A ghost in the inventory system that added and then subtracted 1,000 units in the span of a nanosecond. His tech team, a collection of the brightest minds money could poach, had assured him it was nothing. System optimization, their reports read. Standard performance fluctuations. But Alastair felt it in his gut, a low-grade dread that tasted like ozone and static. He felt like a homesteader watching the sky for a storm only he could sense, a darkening on the horizon that everyone else dismissed as a passing cloud. Down in the echoing hallways of the lower levels, where the opulence of the executive floors faded into polished concrete and fluorescent lighting, another kind of silence reigned. It was the silence of invisibility. Samuel, the night janitor, moved through these halls with a quiet dignity, his cart a familiar, squeaking ghost. He had worked for Finch Industries for 20 years, long enough to have seen Alastair as a boy, trailing in his father's wake. Samuel's silence was one of choice and necessity, the protective coloration of a man who saw everything and said nothing. His daughter, Elara, often helped him on weekends. She was a girl of 19, with her father's quiet eyes and a stillness that was often mistaken for shyness. The employees who saw her, if they saw her at all, saw only the janitor's daughter, a part of the building's unseen machinery. They did not see the mind that blazed behind her eyes, a mind that devoured textbooks on quantum computing and saw beauty in the elegant logic of a well-written algorithm. She had taught herself to code at 13, building worlds on a second-hand laptop her father had salvaged. Her university scholarship applications, filled with brilliant, theoretical work on neural networks, had been met with polite, unseeing rejection letters. The world, it seemed, was not yet ready to look for genius in the daughter of a janitor. That night, as Alastair stared out at the city, a single red light began to blink on his private console. A warning from the heart of Helios. It blinked once, twice, a frantic, desperate heartbeat. Then it went dark, and throughout the entire tower, in the core, in the offices, in the data centers across the globe, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the absolute, profound, and terrifying silence of death. The heart of Finch Industries had just stopped beating. The silence was a physical blow. For a moment, the entire building seemed to hold its breath. The low, omnipresent hum of the servers, a sound so constant it had become a part of the air itself, was gone. In its absence, a new sound emerged, the frantic, rising tide of human panic. Alastair felt the floor drop out from under him. He was on the phone in an instant, his voice sharp, clipped, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in his stomach. His head of IT, a man named Reynolds with a PhD from MIT and an ego to match, was already sputtering. It's impossible. Helios is a closed loop. It can't just stop. But it had. Alistair descended to the core, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows down the sterile corridors. The server room, usually a vibrant city of blinking green and blue lights, was a graveyard. Every rack was dark, every screen blank. The only light came from the red emergency strobes that pulsed with a sick, rhythmic beat, painting the faces of the assembled tech team in panicked shades of crimson. They swarmed around the terminals, their voices a cacophony of jargon and blame. It's a cascading power failure. No, the colonel panicked. It's a core corruption. Did anyone push the latest security patch? Their brilliance, once the bedrock of the company, had fractured into a dozen competing theories, each one a desperate attempt to explain the unthinkable. Alistair stood in the center of the chaos, feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone. He was the captain of a ship that had just struck a phantom iceberg, and his crew of master navigators was screaming at each other about the tides. For hours, they fought the silence. They rebooted systems that wouldn't respond. They ran diagnostics that returned only gibberish. They tried to access backups that had been mysteriously wiped. Helios was not just offline, it was gone. It had vanished into the digital ether, taking with it every piece of data, every transaction, every contract that made Finch Industries a global power. The financial implications were catastrophic. Every minute the system was down cost them millions. The stock would plummet when the markets opened. Their competitors would descend like vultures. This was not a glitch. It was an extinction-level event. By midnight, the initial frenzy had given way to a grim, exhausted despair. The tech team, their faces pale and drawn, were slumped in their chairs, staring at dead screens. Reynolds was on the phone with a consulting firm in Zurich, his voice strained, begging for help that was continents away. Alistair walked the perimeter of the room, his footsteps the only sound besides the quiet weeping of a junior programmer in the corner. He felt the weight of his father's legacy pressing down, suffocating him. His father had built this system, this impenetrable fortress, and Alistair, his unworthy son, had let it fall. It was in this moment of absolute desolation that the door to the core hissed open. Samuel, the janitor, stood there with his cart, his expression calm and apologetic. "Mr. Finch, sir, I'm sorry to intrude, but it's past midnight. Time for my rounds." Reynolds looked up, his face a mask of scorn. "Get out. Can't you see we're in the middle of a major crisis?" Samuel simply nodded, his dignity unruffled. "Yes, sir, I can see that." He began to turn, but Elara, who had been standing just behind him, stepped forward. She hadn't meant to be here, but her father's shift was late, and she had brought him a thermos of hot coffee. Her eyes, however, were not on the angry executives. They were on a small, overlooked diagnostic panel on a far wall, a relic of her father's original design that most of the new team had dismissed as obsolete. A single, tiny amber light was pulsing faintly, a pattern so subtle it was almost invisible. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." Samuel followed her gaze. Alistair, drawn by the sudden shift in the room's energy, looked too. He saw nothing but a dusty, forgotten corner. "What is it?" he asked, his voice harsh with exhaustion. Elara didn't speak to him. She moved past the expensive, useless terminals, her worn sneakers silent on the polished floor. She knelt before the old panel, her fingers tracing the faded schematic diagram beside it. "It's not a power failure," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "It's a handshake protocol. It's failing the authentication loop." Reynolds scoffed from across the room. "That's legacy code. It hasn't been active in a decade. It's irrelevant." "No, it's not," Elara said, her voice quiet but certain. She pointed a finger at the pulsing light. "It's the first gate, the master key. The whole system is waiting for a signal that isn't coming. It thinks it's under attack, so it's playing dead." The room fell silent. The exhausted, high-paid geniuses turned to stare at the janitor's daughter, who was speaking a language they had either forgotten or never bothered to learn. Alistair really looked at her for the first time. He saw not a girl in a faded hoodie, but a mind at work, a focus so intense it seemed to bend the light around her. In a room full of panicked experts, she was the only calm one. She was the only one who wasn't looking at the chaos. She was listening to the silence, and it was telling her secrets. Alistair crossed the room, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of something he hadn't felt in hours: curiosity. He knelt beside Elara, his expensive suit creasing on the cold floor. "What do you mean, playing dead?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its executive bark. Elara didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the panel, her mind clearly miles away, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the code. "My father designed the core architecture with a scuttling charge protocol," she said, her voice distant. "A digital dead man's switch. If the system detects a breach at its most fundamental level, it doesn't just shut down. It erases its own operational pathways to prevent a hostile takeover. It severs its own nerves. It's not dead. It's in a self-induced coma." Reynolds let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's science fiction. Corporate security doesn't work that way." "His did," Elara said, a steely edge to her quiet voice. She finally turned her head, and her gaze met Alistair's. He was paranoid. He always said the biggest threat wasn't a frontal assault, but a traitor with a key. This protocol was designed to protect the system's heart from someone who already had access. The words hung in the air. A traitor with a key. Alistair felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. He looked around at the faces of his trusted team, and for the first time saw them through a lens of suspicion. Samuel, her father, stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Elara, maybe we should go. This is not our place." "No," Alistair said, his voice firm. He stood up, turning to face the room. "Let her work." The statement was met with a wave of disbelief. "Sir," Reynolds sputtered, "with all due respect, she's a child. A janitor's daughter. We have the best minds in the industry here." "The best minds in the industry have been staring at dead screens for 6 hours," Alistair retorted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "She is the first person to see something, anything, that isn't a dead end. She has the console." He gestured to an auxiliary terminal near the old panel. "Someone give her access." A junior tech, eager to do something, anything, that wasn't failing, quickly logged her in. Elara sat down, her posture changing. The quiet, almost hesitant girl disappeared, replaced by someone else, someone focused and assured. Her fingers, long and graceful, hovered over the keyboard for a moment, and then they began to move. It wasn't the frantic, percussive typing of the other techs. It was a fluid, rhythmic dance, a conversation with the machine. Lines of code, archaic and dense, began to scroll across the screen. She was bypassing the modern user interfaces, the layers of software added over the years, and speaking directly to the system's ancient, powerful core. The room watched, mesmerized. The other programmers leaned in, their faces a mixture of skepticism and grudging admiration. They didn't understand the language she was using, a proprietary command line her father had built, but they recognized the elegance, the sheer, audacious skill of it. Alistair stood behind her, watching the screen over her shoulder. He felt like a man watching a master blacksmith at the forge, each command a carefully placed hammer blow, shaping the raw material of the code. He had never understood his father's work on this level, had only ever seen the polished, finished product. Now, he was seeing its creation in reverse, its deconstruction and rebirth. An hour passed, then another. Samuel stood quietly in the corner, a silent, proud guardian. He had seen this focus in his daughter before, when she was piecing together broken circuit boards or losing herself for hours in the stark beauty of a mathematical proof. He knew she was in her element, a place where the world's judgments and hierarchies ceased to exist. "I'm in," Elara said softly. A collective gasp went through the room. On the main screen, a single line of text appeared, stark white against the black void. Helios kernel. Authentication required. It's asking for a password, Reynolds said, stating the obvious. A master key that doesn't exist in any of our documentation. Elara's fingers flew across the keyboard again. She wasn't trying to guess the password. She was building a bridge, a way to talk to the lockdown system. She was asking it questions, not in English, but in the pure, unassailable language of logic. Query: system status. Response: hibernation active. Trigger: protocol 34B. Query: define protocol 34B. Response: hostile ingress detected at primary data node. Scuttling sequence initiated. Elara paused. Someone with top-level access triggered the kill switch, she said, her voice grim. But they did it from inside the system. It wasn't an attack from the outside. It was a betrayal. Alistair's jaw clenched. Who? Who has that level of access? Only 4 people, Reynolds said, his face pale. You, me, the head of security, and Bryce Collier. The name dropped into the room like a stone. Bryce Collier, Alistair's ambitious, ruthless COO, the man who had been his chief rival for the CEO position after his father's death. Alistair had never trusted him, but his father had valued his aggressive tactics. Where is Bryce? Alistair demanded. He went home hours ago, someone murmured. Said he had a sick child. Elara ignored the corporate drama. She was focused on the puzzle. The password. It wouldn't be a word. My father hated sentiment. It would be a logic problem. A constant. Her eyes unfocused for a moment. He was obsessed with prime numbers, she whispered. And the golden ratio. She began to type again, not words, but a long, complex string of digits, a sequence that seemed to have no pattern but was, in fact, the very definition of one. She hit enter. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The cursor just blinked, a lonely, mocking star in a black universe. Then the screen flickered, and in the center of the vast, dead server room, a single server rack hummed to life, its lights blinking a soft, hopeful green. A single, collective sigh of relief went through the room. It was not a fix, but it was a beginning. It was a rescue. Alistair looked at Elara, at her face illuminated by the glow of the screen, and he felt a profound sense of awe. This quiet, overlooked girl had just walked into the heart of his fallen kingdom and, with nothing but her intellect and a deep, intuitive understanding, had coaxed a flicker of life from its ashes. The single green light was a lighthouse in a sea of darkness. It wasn't a solution, but it was proof of life, a signal that the heart of Helios, though silenced, was not yet dead. The mood in the core shifted from one of despair to one of tense, fragile hope. The other programmers, their arrogance shattered, now watched Elara not as an intruder, but as their only guide out of the digital wilderness. They offered her coffee, which her father quietly accepted for her. They cleared a space around her terminal, giving her a wide berth of respect. Alistair pulled up a chair and sat beside her, no longer a CEO overseeing a crisis, but a student watching a master. What happens now? He asked, his voice quiet, deferential. Now we have a conversation, Elara said, her eyes never leaving the screen. The system is awake, but it's still in lockdown. I have to convince it that the threat is gone and that I'm a friend. I have to rebuild the trust protocol from the ground up. For the next few hours, she worked with a surgeon's precision. Her fingers moved in a steady, unhurried rhythm, weaving lines of code that were both a diagnosis and a cure. She was not just inputting commands. She was coaxing, reasoning, and negotiating with the ghost of her father's logic. She found the broken pathways, the severed nerves of the system, and began to painstakingly stitch them back together. She worked in a state of pure flow, the rest of the world fading away. The corporate intrigue, the panicked executives, the weight of the millions of dollars bleeding away every second. None of it touched her. There was only the code, a perfect, elegant puzzle that she had been born to solve. Alistair watched, fascinated. He saw more than just technical skill. He saw an artistry, a deep, intuitive empathy for the machine. She treated Helios not as an object, but as a living entity, one that had been wounded and had retreated into a protective shell. He thought of his father, a man who had often seemed more comfortable with machines than with people. Had his father felt this same connection, this same quiet communion with the systems he built? For the first time, Alistair felt a pang of understanding for the remote, brilliant man he had never been able to get close to. He was seeing his father's mind at work, channeled through the hands of a 19-year-old girl in a faded hoodie. Samuel stood by the door, a silent sentinel. He refilled his daughter's coffee, placed a sandwich beside her keyboard which she ignored, and watched her with a look of profound, aching pride. He had always known she was brilliant. He had seen her dismantle and rebuild an old radio at the age of 8, had watched her read his college physics textbooks as a child, her brow furrowed in concentration. He had worried that the world, with its careless judgments and rigid boxes, would never see what he saw. Now, in this cold, sterile room, surrounded by the most powerful men in the company, his daughter was proving him right. She was not just capable, she was extraordinary. The bond between Elara and Alistair formed in that shared, focused silence. He didn't offer suggestions. He knew he was out of his depth. Instead, he became her logistical support. He got her a more comfortable chair. He had food and drinks brought in for her and her father. He stood guard, fielding calls from the board of directors and deflecting the rising panic from their international offices, creating a protective bubble around her so she could work. He was protecting his company, yes, but he was also protecting her focus, her rare and precious gift. Bryce Collier, the COO, arrived around 4 a.m., his expression a carefully constructed mask of concern. "Alistair, what is going on? My phone has been ringing off the hook. I came as soon as I heard." His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene. He saw the exhausted tech team, the single humming server rack, and his gaze finally landed on Elara, sitting at the main console. A look of sheer, undisguised contempt crossed his face. "What is she doing here?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "This is a level 5 security zone. Get her out of that chair. Now." "She's staying," Alistair said, his voice flat and cold. "She's the only reason this company might still exist by sunrise. She's the janitor's daughter," Bryce exclaimed, his voice rising. "For God's sake, Alistair, have you lost your mind? The board will have your head for this. We have protocols, we have certified professionals, we have a disaster." Alistair cut him off, standing to face him. "And our certified professionals have failed. She has succeeded. She stays." End of discussion. Bryce's eyes narrowed, his mind clearly racing. He looked from Alistair's resolute face to Elara, who hadn't even looked up from her screen, completely absorbed in her work. A flicker of something, fear, calculation, passed through his eyes. He backed down, but his retreat was strategic, not a surrender. "Fine," he said, forcing a conciliatory tone. "You're the CEO. It's your call. And your funeral." He walked over to Reynolds, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Let me know if I can do anything to help. I'll be in my office, trying to manage the fallout with our investors." He left, but his presence lingered, a cold slick of oil on the surface of the room's fragile hope. Elara didn't notice. She had found something. Deep within the system's core log, a file that had been encrypted and hidden, she found a single line of code that didn't belong. It was a trigger, a tiny malicious piece of programming designed to initiate the scuttling protocol and then erase itself. But the system had gone into hibernation so fast that the self-erasure command had failed to execute. It was the digital equivalent of a single, spent cartridge left at a crime scene. "I found it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair leaned in. "What is it?" "The weapon," she replied, her eyes glowing with the thrill of the hunt. "Now let's find out who pulled the trigger." The discovery of the malicious code changed the atmosphere in the core from a rescue mission to a manhunt. The single line of code was a digital fingerprint, and Elara was now a forensic detective carefully dusting for prints. The other programmers gathered around her terminal, their earlier skepticism replaced by a unified, focused intensity. This was no longer about a system crash. It was about an attack from within. It was a betrayal. The code was designed to look like a system error, Elara explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard, bringing up streams of data. It piggybacked on a routine diagnostic sweep, which is why it bypassed all the primary security alerts. It was clever, intimate. The person who wrote this knew the system's architecture as well as my father did. Alistair's mind immediately went to Bryce. Bryce had been with the company for 15 years. He had worked alongside Alistair's father, had learned the intricacies of Helios directly from its creator. He had the knowledge, and he certainly had the motive. If the company collapsed, Bryce, with his connections to rival firms, stood to gain immensely. But motive wasn't proof. Can you trace it? Alistair asked, his voice low and tense. The entry point? I'm trying, Elara said. The code scrubbed its own pathway, but it left echoes. Faint data trails in the server logs. It's like following footprints in a blizzard, but they're there. For the next hour, she chased these digital ghosts through the labyrinth of the system. It was painstaking work. She cross-referenced timestamps, analyzed data packet fragments, and pieced together a timeline of the attack. Alistair watched, feeling a strange mix of helplessness and awe. He was the king of this empire, yet he was utterly dependent on the skills of this quiet, 19-year-old girl to save it. He saw the looks from his team. Reynolds, in particular, watched Elara with a dawning, humbling respect. Everything he had learned, every degree and certification he had earned, was worthless in the face of this. Elara wasn't just applying knowledge. She was creating it, innovating in real time. Samuel, her father, brought her a fresh cup of coffee. He didn't speak, but he squeezed her shoulder, a silent message of encouragement. He saw the strain in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands, but he also saw the fierce, burning light of her intellect, and he knew she would not fail. The trail led them to a senior programmer's workstation, a man who had been with the company for a decade. A wave of confusion went through the room. The programmer in question was a quiet, unassuming family man, not a saboteur. But as Elara dug deeper, she saw that his terminal had been accessed remotely, using stolen credentials, just minutes before the crash. The real attacker had used him as a scapegoat. The digital footprints were clever, layered, designed to misdirect. But Elara was more clever. She followed a secondary data stream, a ghost image of the remote connection, and found its origin point. A terminal on the 80th floor. The executive floor. A chill went through the room. It came from upstairs, Reynolds breathed. Elara kept digging, her focus absolute. She ran a trace route, her commands a blur on the screen. The signal bounced through 3 different proxy servers, a sophisticated attempt to hide its source. But the final signal, the one that had sent the kill command, had originated from a single, hardwired terminal. She brought up the building's network schematic, a blueprint of its digital soul. She cross-referenced the terminal's ID number. A location appeared on the screen, stark and damning. Floor, 80. Office, 8012. Assigned to Bryce Collier, Coup. The room was silent. There it was. The proof. The smoking gun. It was in that moment of triumph that Bryce Collier chose to re-enter the core. He strolled in, a smug, confident look on his face, holding a tablet. Alistair, he said, his voice smooth as polished glass. I've just been on a conference call with the board. They are concerned about your handling of this crisis. Specifically, he paused for dramatic effect, about your decision to put an untrained, unvetted civilian in charge of our most sensitive systems. They're calling for an emergency vote to have you temporarily removed as CEO, pending a full investigation. I try to defend you, of course, but he let the sentence hang in the air, a perfectly crafted threat. He thought he was delivering the final, killing blow. He had no idea he had just walked into his own execution. Alistair turned to face him, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry. He looked calm. Is that so, Bryce? He said quietly. Well, before the board votes on my future, perhaps they'd be interested in seeing what our untrained civilian has discovered. He nodded to Elara. Elara swiveled in her chair, her quiet eyes fixing on Bryce for the first time. She didn't speak. She simply typed one final command. On the massive screen at the front of the room, the screen that had been black for nearly 9 hours, the evidence appeared. The trace route. The terminal ID. The name, Bryce Collier. Bryce's face went white. The color drained from it as if a plug had been pulled. His smug confidence shattered, replaced by a raw, animal panic. That's absurd, he stammered. It's fabricated. She faked it. Reynolds, the head of IT, stepped forward, his voice firm. I've been watching her every move for the last 3 hours, Bryce. That data is real. The logs are immutable. It was you. Bryce looked around the room, at the faces of the programmers who were now staring at him with open contempt, at Samuel the janitor, whose expression was one of quiet, profound justice, and finally at Alistair, whose calm was more terrifying than any rage. Bryce had underestimated all of them. He had seen a grieving son, a timid girl, and a group of cowed employees. He had not seen the king, the warrior, and the army they commanded. Security, Alistair said, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute weight of command. 2 guards, who had been standing by the door, stepped forward. Bryce made a move for the door, but it was too late. He was trapped, brought down not by a corporate takeover or a market crash, but by the brilliant, relentless mind of the girl he had dismissed as nothing. As they led him away, his frantic, empty denials echoing in the now-humming server room, Elara finally looked away from the screen. She looked at her father, who gave her a single, proud nod. Then she looked at Alistair. The system was coming back online, rack by rack, the green lights spreading like a dawn. She had not only saved the company, she had exposed its deepest wound. And in the process, she had shown all of them what true power looked like. It wasn't in a title or a corner office. It was in a quiet mind, a steady hand, and the courage to see the truth when everyone else was blinded by the dark. With Bryce's betrayal exposed and the system slowly returning to life, a new kind of energy filled the core. The frantic panic was replaced by a sense of purpose, of rebuilding. Under Elara's quiet direction, the tech team, humbled and unified, worked to restore the network. They were no longer a team of competing egos. They were her lieutenants, executing her commands with a newfound respect and efficiency. Elara, in turn, was a natural leader. She didn't raise her voice or issue harsh commands. She explained her logic, drew diagrams on whiteboards, and empowered the other programmers to take ownership of their sections of the network. She was teaching them, rebuilding not just the system, but the team itself. Alistair watched the transformation, a sense of profound change settling over him. He had inherited his father's company, but he had never truly felt like its leader. He had managed its assets, but he had never understood its soul. Now, watching Elara work, he felt a connection to his father's legacy that had always eluded him. He saw that the true foundation of Finch Industries was not its stock price or its market share, but the brilliant, innovative spirit that had created it. A spirit that lived on, not in him, but in the janitor's daughter. He made a call to the head of his legal department, his instructions precise and unwavering. He wanted a full prosecution of Bryce Collier for corporate sabotage. He wanted a complete audit of all of Bryce's projects, searching for other signs of corruption. There would be no quiet severance package, no sweeping this under the rug. Bryce had tried to kill the company, and he would face the consequences. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink by the time Helios was fully stable. The screens were all lit, the data was flowing, and the hum of the servers was a steady, reassuring song. The crisis was over. The programmers began to file out, their faces etched with exhaustion, but also with a kind of exhilaration. They each stopped by Elara's workstation, offering a quiet word of thanks, a nod of respect. Reynolds was the last to leave. He stood before her for a moment, his hands in his pockets. I was wrong, he said, the admission clearly costing him. What you did here, it was beyond anything I've ever seen. You're a prodigy. Elara simply nodded, accepting the apology without malice. The system is beautiful, she said softly. It was a privilege to work on it. When they were gone, only 3 people remained in the vast, humming room. Alistair, Elara, and her father, Samuel. A comfortable silence settled between them. Samuel walked over to his daughter and placed a hand on her head, his touch full of a love and pride that needed no words. Alistair cleared his throat. Elara, He began, his voice formal. I cannot begin to express the company's gratitude. You have saved us from an extinction-level event. There will be, of course, a significant financial reward. A finder's fee, a bonus, name your price. Elara looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a hint of a smile on her face. It was small, but it lit up her tired eyes. I don't want a reward, Mr. Finch, she said. Then what do you want? I want a job, she said simply. I want work here. With Helios. It feels like home. Alistair felt a laugh escape him. A real, genuine laugh. It felt foreign and wonderful. A job, he repeated. Miss Elara, you can have any job you want. I was thinking of creating a new position. Head of Systems Architecture and Innovation. You would report directly to me. You would have your own team, your own budget. Your only mandate would be to protect and evolve Helios, to keep it 10 years ahead of everyone else, just as your father intended. Elara looked at her own father, whose eyes were shining with tears. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She looked back at Alistair. I accept, she said. Alistair extended his hand. Welcome to Finch Industries, he said. As her small, strong hand clasped his, he felt not just that he had hired a new employee, but that he had found a partner, an heir to his father's true legacy. The resolution was swift and decisive. Bryce Collier was arrested, his corporate empire crumbling into dust. The board of directors, faced with the undeniable truth of his betrayal and Alistair's newfound, decisive leadership, gave Alistair their unanimous, enthusiastic support. The company's stock, after a brief, terrifying dip, rebounded stronger than ever as the story, carefully curated by Alistair's PR team, of the thwarted sabotage and the brilliant, mysterious coder who saved them, became a legend in the financial world. Elara's transition from janitor's daughter to executive was seamless. She moved into a corner office not far from Alistair's, but she spent most of her time in the core, her natural habitat. She built a small, elite team of programmers who shared her passion and respected her genius. The culture of the company began to change, the stuffy, hierarchical structure giving way to a more innovative, collaborative environment. Samuel, her father, was offered a generous early retirement package, but he politely declined. I like my rounds, he said simply, but there was a new spring in his step, a new light in his eye. Every employee, from the executives to the mailroom clerks, now greeted him with a profound and genuine respect. He was no longer the invisible janitor. He was the father of the woman who had saved them all. The bond between Alistair and Elara deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared reverence for the beautiful, complex system they now protected together. Theirs was not a romance, but something quieter and, perhaps, more profound. It was a partnership of minds, a deep, intellectual intimacy. They would spend hours in the core, brainstorming, debating, and dreaming of the future. He taught her about the business, about the complex dance of markets and men. She taught him about the code, about the elegant hidden poetry of the digital world. One evening, months later, they were standing before the main server bank, the lights of Helios blinking like a galaxy of stars. My father would have liked you, Alistair said quietly. He would have been intimidated by you, and he would have admired you more than anyone. I think I knew him, Elara said, her gaze soft. I met him in the code. Alistair nodded, understanding completely. He looked around at the thriving heart of his company, at the quiet, brilliant woman beside him, and felt a sense of peace he had never known. The legacy he had inherited was no longer a burden. It was a gift, one he now shared. The silence in the core was no longer one of absence or fear. It was the quiet, powerful hum of a heart that had been broken and then, against all odds, had been made whole again, stronger and more brilliant than before. The janitor's daughter had not just saved the kingdom. She had shown the king where its true treasure lay.